Hello, listeners. Welcome to the latest Footnote episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
We are doing... Now, this is... I feel like I always start these footnotes like this, going, oh, this is something... You just sprung this on me.
Well, it's just because we're in the middle of our psychoanalysis mini-series, Chris.
Yes.
So you really
Which was planned at the time and
Yes.
definitely not something that we retrospectively thought, this would be quite good.
Yeah.
So we are doing, and I'm just going to say it, object relations.
Yes.
So that's that. That is probably all I know about that. But it obviously fits in with our, as you say, our psychoanalysis and our the gaze.
Yeah.
So this completes the trilogy. It's the Back to the Future Part 3, if you will.
Sure.
So with all the connotations that brings.
Yes.
So I will start the timer. Let's do object relations from Dr. Alexander Sargent.
So, previously on psychoanalytic footnotes, we've
Yes.
done Freud and we've done Lacan.
Yes.
The two thinkers, Lacan in particular, that have influenced film studies, film theory in particular's thinking about psychoanalytic approaches to film. Object relations is another branch of psychoanalysis that has been emerged as an alternative / overlapping / I guess some might argue competing way of thinking about cinema. In ways that one, including myself, might argue it can be profitable as getting ourselves out of some of the knotty problems caused by previous engagements with psychoanalysis and cinema that a lot of people don't like, which led to a kind of turn away from psychoanalytic theory, or theory with a capital T, in the sort of early to mid-90s. Some of the diagnoses that people had about what the problem with psychoanalysis was, some have argued has been solved by embracing slightly different methodologies, i.e. object relations. Mm-hmm. You can ask me, so what are they? Or
Well, yes, I mean, I'm just sort of trying to... Okay, so the turn away from... I'm trying to remember, when I was writing the blurbs to these episodes, I was thinking, okay, so we've talked about Freud, we've talked about Lacan, we've talked about this kind of trajectory of psychoanalytic thinking.
70s, 80s film theory, it's all Lacan, it's all the gaze, it's all mirror stages, it's all...
And now we're post-theory?
We came up with Post Theory, which was an edited collection by Noel Carroll and David Baldwell, basically saying, why do we have to talk about films like they're these kind of angst-ridden patients that need
diagnosing
and treating on a couch?
Yep.
Can't we talk about them in different ways, for God's sake? I feel like we've lost a lot of what film is by talking about them in this way. Can we stop doing that, please?
Okay.
And the answer is yes. You can just abandon theory entirely. You can embrace other types of theory. They're for the phenomenology arose.
Yes.
But those of us who still liked a bit of psychoanalysis, this is what we did, or at least this is what some of us did.
Yes. Okay. So early 90s is Address of the Eye, phenomenology.
Yes.
Vivian Sobchak, and now we're turning to object relations.
This is those of us who don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What can we find in psychoanalysis that might be a different way of thinking about film?
Belligerence is what this is.
Yeah, belligerence indeed. So object relations is a branch of psychoanalysis that's formed more in the British school. So Lacan is the French school, or at least a very prominent sort of French psychoanalytic thinker. Object relations comes out of the British Psychoanalytic Society, and in particular there are quite a few thinkers, but two of the key ones are Melanie Klein and D.W. Winnicott, Donald Winnicott, who take Freud's work and try to apply it, particularly thinking about young children, the development of the conscious mind in young children, and in particular, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a second, ideas of fantasy in relation to...
Is that with an F? What's
with
that?
An F,
okay.
Chris. With a PH, Chris.
Okay.
With a PH, Chris. Fantasy, as in a form of kind of meaning making rather than fantasy like goblins and stuff.
Okay, so... Yes. Okay. Fantasy versus fantasy.
One of the key thinkers that have applied these kind of thoughts is Annette Kuhn, established film scholar, professor, notable thinker. Her collection or her work, Little Madnesses, Winnicott's Transitional Phenomena and Culture Experience, is one of the first to apply object relations psychoanalysis to think about film, filmmaking, and other kind of types of.
So this is still
experience.
90s. This is still
Little Madnesses is 2013. Oh yeah, we've jumped straight.
Right, so this is quite a recent, quote unquote, recent way of thinking about our relationship to cinema, open to the text, as you say, the sort of development. So how does that work then? Kind of young children, you said the development of conscious thinking.
Yes. So Winnicott basically is the person, one of the people we can turn to. Winnicott and Klein are the two. Klein is a psychoanalytic thinker who is very interested in how children formulate relationships with the world and uses a lot of theories of unconscious fantasies to do that. We can go into them, but we probably haven't got time. Winnicott kind of takes Klein's ideas, adapts them, thinks about them, and is particularly interested in things like the role of creativity in everyday life, the role of play in everyday life. And one of the key terms he comes up with, and it's there in the title of Little Madnesses, transitional phenomenon, is this idea of the importance of transitional objects in our kind of psychic well-being. And transitional objects, as simply as possible, are objects that somehow, through their cultural function, are allowed to be neither fully objective objects nor fully subjective objects.
Right.
So his example would be like a baby's cloth, babies that have cloths to kind of a comforter blanket.
Comfort blanket, yeah.
So on one hand, it's an objective object. It's a comforter blanket. It needs to be objective. The child needs the blanket.
Yeah.
If the blanket isn't there, the child cries. They can't just imagine the blanket.
Yes.
They need that blanket.
Yes.
But what the blanket is some kind of object through which they can channel feelings of security and things like that.
Okay.
So it's an object to fantasize with.
Okay.
So it needs to be a bit objective, but it also needs to have space to throw upon one's subjective fantasies.
And how might that work with
So we might
cinema?
talk about all kinds of cultural phenomenon as being essentially transitional objects, right?
Okay.
So film, art...
so film is both a
games.
screen that you see, but it is also a...
Yes, you have to see the film. You can't just make up a film in your head.
Yes.
But part of the pleasure is what you bring to the film. It's that old cliche again, as much as what the film gives to you.
So is this connected, or is this doesn't seem kind of a million miles away from phenomenology insofar as thinking about experience?
Yes, it's
perhaps?
not. Well, it is and it isn't. I'm with you. I think it isn't a million miles away, but I guess the difference is phenomenology is all about the kind of the affective realm, the bodily realm, the touch of a film, the connective
haptic.
That whilst this is much more about kind of it's still in the mind. It's about imagining. How one processes these things, object relations, how the mind makes sense of external objects.
So does this relate? This seems to be about our engagement with cinema more broadly. You have to see the
Little
film.
Madnesses certainly is, yes.
So the next question or the next stage is, is there a kind of specific way in which this works with fantasy cinema with an F or not? Or
yes. I mean, Encountering the Possible, still available in all good bookshops.
Yeah, it's just not selling, that's why.
But with a minute or two left, I guess to give you an example.
Yeah.
Films trigger our fantasies. All films trigger our fantasies. So the game becomes, using object relations theory, what kind of object is a film? Okay, so is it, when one starts to pick these apart, we have fantastical relationships with all objects. I have fantastical relationships with my sofa because it represents memories of security and comfort, and it's my sofa. It's not just an external sofa and all this kind of stuff. But there is a difference between that and some dice on a game, or a counter, or these kind of objects that seem deliberately kind of extra transitional. Well, I would argue fantasy often encourages us to think about those kind of objects, those kind of extremely playful objects, as opposed to thinking of a filmmaking like you might think like a sofa.
So it intensifies the stuff that Klein and et al. Are talking about in terms of creativity and play. And fantasy is something that sort of, if we're thinking about object relations as the way in which conscious thinking and forming relations to the world, fantasy is intensifying those kinds of relationships.
Fantasy, through the way it is made and the kind of stories it's told and the way it tells the stories, gives us license to play with it in a way that other objects in our everyday life that are supposedly grounded in reality do not. You cannot play with some objects in life, but you can play with dice, or you can play with an action figure, or you can play with a doll.
Yes.
They are objects designed to be played with.
Yes.
Whilst a hammer is not such an object, right?
Thank you for that dramatic, dramatic dichotomy. So you have a minute left exactly. So you've mentioned Winnicott, Klein, Annette Kuhn's Little Madnesses, some other book about encountering the impossible. Anything else?
Winnicott, if you're interested in this and want to go to the source, Playing in Reality, his book's very, very good on that. Melanie Klein has some very, very dense works, but not that many of them, which is lucky for, I'm sure, lots of people. I would recommend, there's 4 volumes of her work. They're all interesting, but volume 4, Narrative of a Child Analysis, is kind of the most penetrable and is a bit more kind of her talking through how she comes up with these theories in relationship to actual patients rather than the very dense theory of some of her other work. There's others. Wilfred Bion is another object relations. And there's many more who I haven't got time to mention. Rathburn, but from the kind of British School of Psychoanalysis.
Excellent, brilliant.
It's all good stuff. Go and read it.
Absolutely. So we have 8 seconds, and we are done. So you're under time, under budget, as it were.
Done.
Yes.
First. Great. So yes, that's object relations, a branch of psychoanalysis applied to film studies.
Lovely stuff. Okay. There you go.
Thanks, everyone. If you would like me to stop doing this never-ending series on psychoanalysis, don't worry, it's going to stop today.
I've already emailed in.
Yes, Chris has already emailed in. But otherwise, email in with your own suggestions at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. But we'll see you next time.
Bye.